Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel and welcome to my omnibus series. I've got so many of these omnibuses that are going to come out so that you'll be able to listen to an hour's worth of stories, which I know you're going to love. You know, the thing is that telling stories is such a fine art, and it's something that was practiced hundreds of years ago when people didn't have the technology that we have today. And everyone would gather around the fire and listen to a wonderful story. And also, what is so wonderful about a story is that personally, I think it is the best way to go to sleep. Every night when I go to bed, I always listen to stories. And that's something that parents used to do with their children. It's something that they still do with their children. There's nothing better than a good story. And so I hope you're going to enjoy this series. And before we start, I just want to say, do subscribe to my channel because you don't want to miss out on anything. Because I'm in for the long haul and I want to make sure that you get the most stunning stories to go to bed with at night or to listen to when you want to be one of those people sitting beside the fire and listening. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and let's get started. I hope you're going to enjoy the omnibus.
Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my Bigfoot encounter happened in the year 2003 when I went to stay with my sister and her husband in America. And I also have a ghost story that might be of interest to your listeners, as I know people are fascinated by the paranormal these days, and I'm no exception to that rule. I grew up in Oxford, England with my younger sister Kate in a single-parent home as my mother got divorced from my father when I was only 3 years old. I'm sure your listeners know that Oxford is a historic old town with a youthful, vibrant ambience that is steeped in history, and it is a place that is alive with cobbled streets, young students, pubs, interesting shops, and of course a very distinguished university that draws students from all over the world. My sister and I grew up in a very old Victorian home, a mere bicycle ride from the bustling town. The house had been converted into 3 individual homes that were stacked very close together, and from the moment we moved in we experienced paranormal activity, like drafts coming into the room on a warm day, and the sounds of footsteps running up and down the staircase. I was 5 and my younger sister was 4. At the time my mother thought that I had an invisible friend, because I would always be talking to someone that she couldn't see. I would play for hours with a little girl wearing a white dress with a green sash around her waist and white shoes. All these years later, I remember her so very clearly. She told me that her name was Susan Price and that she had died from falling down the large wooden staircase in our home. I remember thinking that this dead friend of mine was as real as a living being, because even though it was strange that she could just vanish in a flash of light, like a light switch being turned off, it would always puzzle me that my mother could never physically see her. When my sister Kate turned 5, she also started to play with little Susan, and also remembers the experience almost as vividly as I do. She recalls waking up in the middle of the night to see Susan sitting at the end of the bed, wanting to play with us. It would seem that the little girl never got physically tired, nor did she ever get any older. One day my mother was washing dishes in the kitchen sink when she thought she saw a 5-year-old girl swinging on my swing set out on the lawn with one of my white teddy bears perched on her lap. My mother wondered who this mystery girl was and what she was actually doing in our yard, so she went outside to talk to the little girl and ask her where her mother was. Not for a moment did my mother consider that this girl was not real, but she did think that the dress that the girl was wearing was incredibly fancy. As she approached the swing, the little girl seemed to fade and then suddenly dissolved before her eyes, like a water bubble that floats in the air and then pops and then is finally gone. She could hardly believe what she'd actually seen, and she thought her imagination was playing tricks on her. And then she saw my white teddy bear that had fallen underneath the swing set, and it appeared to be moving. In that moment, she knew that she had actually seen a ghost. It was after that event that my mother quizzed me about my invisible friend, and she checked the details against the history of our home. And indeed, there was a girl called Susan Price that had fallen down a staircase in an accident and died when she was 5 years old during the Victorian era. Susan Price was soon to disappear from my life when I got a little older. Maybe by then I was a lot less sensitive to her presence and could no longer see her anymore. Or maybe she had withdrawn from my life because I was that much older. What we did notice, though, was that when young people came to our home who were about 5 years old, they appeared to be able to play with someone that the adults couldn't see, and neither could we anymore, which saddened me immensely. I do believe emphatically that they were playing with little Susan. Sometimes in our home we would experience a much more menacing presence. It did not really make any sense to us until we were a little older. Once my sister Kate was a little bit older, at about 9 years old, she was walking down the steps and she felt a freezing cold hand touching her back, and for a moment she felt certain that something wanted to push her over. For a long while it appeared that my sister was the target of a very formidable dark force. Kate was so terrified because in her bedroom at night she could swear she saw a dark shadow and heard a disembodied voice, and even woke up with an unexplained bruising and scratching on her body. There were also times when her duvet cover would slide off her bed mysteriously, only to be found lying in a crumpled heap on the living room floor, which was a fair way away from the bedroom. One day my mother was having a few girlfriends at home and hosting a book club gathering to discuss the most recent book that she'd been reading. One of her girlfriends, who she did not know at the time, was a psychic who told my mother that there was a little girl sitting at the end of the stairs called Susan, who was watching us with a keen interest and listening in to the conversation. My mother asked this friend why Susan was still here in our home and why she hadn't moved on. Her girlfriend told my mother that Susan was trapped here by her uncle, who had pushed her down the stairs when she was little, and he was determined to keep her stuck in this location. He was blocking her from crossing over and was a very hostile, disagreeable man who didn't like children at all. "I'm surprised you're not having problems with this nasty man," she said. "I would have thought he could potentially be a problem for your children." My mother then told her about the incident at the stairs, where my sister had felt a cold hand on her back, and also about the scratches and duvet being pulled off her bed. That was when my mother's friend told us that even though this man was not demonic, he wasn't very nice, and he might get more volatile in the future, so we needed to make sure that he left our home, not only for the safety of my sister, but also to set poor little Susan free. It was then that my mother arranged for a priest to come to our home to bless the place, along with a medium who would get the spirits to leave our home. A few days before their visit, things got a little crazy in our home, and the activity escalated, because I think the horrible uncle knew that he would be forced to leave very soon. We had a vase of flowers flung across the living room, and it had been on a very flat surface, so there was no explanation for that. It crashed into thousands of pieces and was literally scattered all over our cream carpet, along with all the flowers and the water. Then a picture of my sister and I was hurled off the wall violently in an expression of rage, and the glass frame was completely shattered. At the time, the frame had narrowly missed hitting my sister Kate, so she was clearly being targeted by this nasty uncle. We also found kitchen cabinets were flung open on their own accord, and when we switched the television off to return to bed at night, it was turned on almost immediately. The medium was a tiny woman called Hope. I think she was about 4 foot tall, with a little portly frame, wispy grey hair that was tied back in a bun, and a face that was as gentle as a doe. By contrast, the priest was 6 foot tall, thin and lanky, with a receding hairline and big brown earnest hazel eyes. He was wearing his priestly robes and clutching a bottle of holy water in his hands, looking a little anxious and very much on edge. We were to find out later that the last blessing that he had done on a recent home had been exceedingly violent, and the dark presence had literally lashed out at him violently, and he'd been pushed over by this formidable force. "It's going to be fine," Howard assured the medium. "I can sense that this energy may be angry and afraid, but I promised you it's not evil, so you're going to be fine tonight." My mother told the medium about the escalation in activity that we'd been experiencing, and she wasn't surprised by those revelations. She said that the menacing uncle was a very lost, confused and frightened soul. He was absolutely terrified of crossing over and getting to the other side, because he believed in hell or purgatory, because he had done some bad things in his earthly life, and was frightened of being condemned. He had clung to Susan like a limpet because he didn't want to be entirely alone in his spiritual state. He wanted to share it with someone. He confessed he had pushed Susan over the stairs, but it wasn't to kill her intentionally, but because he'd been drinking on that day, and he was lashing out at his niece in a drunken rage. He had never been fond of children, but he would never purposely kill someone, he assured us. The medium asked him why he had targeted my little sister Kate so aggressively if that was the case. He told her that my sister was the spitting image of his mother, who had abused him during his earthly life, and he apologized then profusely for his actions. The medium seemed to calm down the uncle's negative energy that had been so draining and oppressive. My mother said you could literally feel it. My mother watched the medium envelop every corner of the house with a smoky aroma of sage, and the priest also scattered holy water all over the place and said some prayers while blessing the house. Then some large white candles were lit, and the medium asked the spirits to move towards the light, and she said that the little girl had stretched her hand towards the reluctant, frightened uncle, and then they had both walked towards the light and vanished. My mother said she never physically saw anything, but she had felt the heaviness just lift, and the house became so much lighter and incredibly bright. I remember feeling sad that Susan had gone, because she had been so much a part of my young life growing up, but I knew that she deserved to be free. Besides, our house did feel so much better without the oppressive energy from the angry uncle. I was also happy that he had moved on and hopefully found peace in a better place. My Bigfoot encounter is a whole other story, and growing up in England, I knew nothing about the hairy man. Sadly, that subject is not really discussed there. Neither did my sister know about him. In truth, we virtually knew nothing about American culture, apart from the fact that we knew it was a country that we loved and would long to visit someday in the future. One day at Oxford University, where my sister was doing an English degree, she was introduced to a delightful American literary student called Keith, and the rest is history. They fell in love, got married, and then both moved to America. My sister and her husband moved to a beautiful home in Chippewa County, which was about 15 miles from the city of Chippewa Falls. They bought a large plot of land there that was under about 200 acres, with about 75 acres of tillable timber, and then there were woods for hunting activities, as well as a large silvery lake providing about 290 feet of river frontage. It was pretty much anything and everything that my sister had ever dreamed of, and living in America was a whole new experience for her. I just cannot get over the space and the wilderness, she would tell me. It's like everything just goes on forever and ever, and that there is no beginning or end. It is so wonderful here. It was not long before I found myself going over to America, and there I was, driving down a large gravel road that was surrounded by pretty trees. It veered off to the right until I came to a very large gate, and the gate was wide open. I drove down a very large white gravel driveway until I reached the beautiful modern-style farmhouse that Keith had purchased with the land, and it had such a magic, rustic charm about it that drew me immediately. It had a large south-facing wooden panel windows and a massive wooden deck that overlooked the ravishing views over the countryside. It had manicured lawns seamlessly blended into a vast area of natural forest. It was all utterly breathtaking. That evening we sat outside and enjoyed the starlit night and the light of the full moon around a crackling fire, and my sister and I shared our ghost stories with her husband, who listened intently with amazement about our story about Susan in our childhood. The night was utterly beautiful, and we could hear the croaks of frogs and the chorus of crickets and the sounds of coyotes. Suddenly we heard these strange whooping sounds, and I asked my sister's husband what they were, and he had absolutely no idea. I told him the calls sounded exactly like primates, and he laughed at me and told me that there were no such things as primates living in America. The following day, because of the time zone differences, which had left me feeling very disorientated, I slept in most of the morning, and my sister understood the fogginess I was feeling, so she actively encouraged me to sleep off all those sluggish feelings, and that's exactly what I did. The only problem was that later in the evening, after my sister and her husband had retreated to bed, I was left feeling wide awake and alert, and the last thing I wanted to do was to actually go to sleep. It was 12:30 and I was drinking a glass of white wine by the fire pit, enjoying the crackling fire and listening to all the lovely animal sounds. It was a light, very beautiful evening, and it was so enchanting here, I thought, secretly envying my sister's brand new life here in America. Maybe I should marry an American, I thought. I quite fancied a life like this. Suddenly at that moment I heard those strange whooping sounds again, and it truly sounded as if they were coming from not too far away. And they did sound like a monkey or a gorilla. It was incredibly weird. I was naturally curious by nature and intrigued, so armed with my sister's flashlight and a pair of walking shoes, I ventured into that wooded area, listening out for all those whooping sounds. The further I walked, the louder the sounds became, so I knew that I was getting closer to the source. I could also hear these strange sounds of wood being knocked. Not once did I consider the possibility that I could be in danger. Coming from England, I was not adverse to going exploring in the night, and I truly thought nothing about it. I walked for a while, crunching leaf litter and twigs under my feet and enjoying the serenity of this beautiful, intriguing night that appeared to have become unusually quiet. I could not hear the frogs or crickets or owls any more, but I was none the wiser, so I ventured towards the whooping sounds, which were the only audible calls that I could actually hear. Suddenly I heard a loud rustling sound, and then a large, long form of about 4 to 5 feet off the ground started growling at me. I could also sense the eyes of a predator on me, and I stepped back in utter horror as my flashlight observed the face of a large cat-like creature glaring at me with blazing eyes and a mouth that curled back to reveal sharp canine teeth. I saw that next to this cat was 2 young cubs that were tearing into the flesh of a large deer carcass that the mother had recently killed because it was pretty much still intact. I knew at once that I was in a life-threatening situation because there is nothing more protective than a mother and her cubs. I had heard stories of people being killed by mountain lions before, so I knew that I was in very big trouble. My heart was pounding violently in my chest, and I was walking backwards as I watched the creature closely. As I moved backwards, the creature was lunging towards me, and I felt almost certain that I was dead. There was no way that I could possibly survive this. The next thing I knew was that this massive arm grabbed me, but I screamed so much because for a moment I thought it was the mouth of another mountain lion that I hadn't actually seen creeping behind me. And once again I screamed again and again. I could feel myself being carried in the arms of a very big creature 8 foot off the ground. I looked down at the body and saw this long dark hair, and I was convinced that I was in the arms of a great big bear. Could this get any worse, I wondered? I had been ripped away from a mountain lion into the arms of another dangerous predator. I knew bears could also kill people, so I was no better off. I remember my life flashed before me 100 miles an hour, and I could feel the tears pouring down my face. I felt this dreadful sadness that my life was invariably over, and I was just wondering how it would end when the creature just plonked me on the ground. I suddenly remembered that someone had told me that during a bear attack that you should play dead, and so I immediately fell on the ground and played dead. As I lay there, I could feel the bear shaking my body, and it was so hard not to scream out in terror, but I knew I needed to be as still as possible, and it was the hardest thing I've ever done in my entire life. Truly, I think it is so much better to run, because lying still when you're beyond terrified is a virtual impossibility. The next thing I heard was a strange chattering sound that sounded like a monkey, and I felt this wet tongue on my face like a dog licking me, and I could smell the taste of ribeye steak on the saliva. The licking was odd behaviour for a bear, so I opened my eyes to find the strange hairy creature staring down at me with concerned brown eyes. But this was no bear. It was something else, but what on earth was it? The creature was absolutely enormous, and it was covered in dark brown hair from head to toe, and it had a huge human-like face, a very distinct brow ridge, a flat nose, and an ape-like mouth. I noticed that the head was almost half moon-shaped, like an egg that kind of blended seamlessly into the large shoulders with not much evidence of a neck. I got up slowly, watching the creature curiously, half expecting it to pounce on me, because this creature was so monstrously big, and about 9 feet tall and 800 pounds. Yet as I raised myself off the ground, the creature started chattering excitedly. I think he was so pleased that I had seemingly risen from the dead, and he had been my hero. He looked like he was pleased with himself, but not once was he even remotely aggressive towards me, but seemed to be gentle and kind. I was astonished because this creature was huge. Imagine for a moment a little teddy bear and blow it up to 8 foot tall and 5 foot wide and cover it with black hair and see how intimidating that is. And that is what this thing was like. Give it flesh and blood and you are looking at something very seriously creepy and highly dangerous. I got up and looked at the creature, and he just stood there, watching me until I made my way back to the house. I looked at him through the kitchen window, and he continued watching the house for a minute or so, and then he disappeared into the forest, seemingly gliding on his long, very agile legs. I promise you I was in awe. I could hardly believe what had just happened to me. I rushed into my sister's room, violently trying to wake her up, and told her my story. Her husband listened with eyes that were as wide as saucers and a jaw that was dropping to the ground. "You are kidding, right?" he kept saying. "This is a joke." "No," I assured him. "This humanoid ape-like creature covered with hair saved my life tonight." "I cannot believe you went into those woods all on your own in the dark," said my sister. "Did you not think that could be a wee bit dangerous for you?" "No, it didn't occur to me," I said. "It saved you from a mountain lion," said my sister's husband, almost meditating on the words in absolute disbelief. "What was it she saw?" asked my sister. "You're American. You should know about these things." My sister's husband said the word Bigfoot under his breath, almost too low for us to hear. "What did you say?" asked my sister. "Bigfoot," he said. "You must have seen a Bigfoot." "Well, who or whatever is a Bigfoot?" asked my sister. "I'm glad he's out there if he's got our backs. It makes me feel a whole lot better." My sister's husband just sat there on the bed, almost frozen to the spot, and said, "Bigfoot? Who would have ever thought of it?" The next day my sister's husband told me never ever under any circumstances to ever tell anyone what I'd actually seen. "No one will ever believe you," he said. "It's an incredible story, but people with story like yours needs to keep their mouth shut. I don't want you to be the subject of ridicule." So there you are. That's my story, and I still cannot believe that my life was saved by this incredible creature. It is truly the most incredible experience of my entire life. My sister is so chuffed that there is a Bigfoot on her land with a heart of gold. She says she feels so safe knowing he's out there. I had an amazing time in America, but I didn't need my knight in shining armour there. So I invariably married an Englishman, and I still live in Oxford, but not in the home where I grew up, but in another home that is 300 years old to date. But I still have not experienced any ghostly activity. From time to time I visit my sister's place, and I always long to get a sighting of the hairy man again that rescued me, but sadly he has remained pretty elusive since then. However, I am assured by my sister that the whooping sounds ever continue on her land. So there you are. That's my story. Well, I just want to thank you for that incredible story. What an incredible thing to be saved from a mountain lion. Dear Sarah, my name is Lucas, and my Bigfoot encounter happened in 2009, around the time of bow hunting season. I do not want to give the details of where the location was, for the specific purposes of keeping all my details strictly private and confidential, if you don't mind. I grew up in the North American wilderness, and my father and grandfather before him were all very keen, astute, and brilliant hunters. My father taught me everything I know today. He gave me wilderness survival skills, fishing, tracking, and hunting abilities. I lived with my parents in a very idyllic wooden cabin, which was quite literally in a very remote area, flanked by vast areas of forest of mainly pine, spruce and large oaks, and I knew those woods like the back of my hands. I also knew of areas unexplored by other hunters that were open for the hunting season, but were so well off the beaten track, in uncharted, unexplored territory, which was ideal for my friend and I, who liked to hunt in those remote areas. Besides, there were some hefty specimen of deer around there, who sensibly knew the best places to keep a low profile during the hunting season, and some had lived out to a hefty old age, because they had surreptitiously avoided the hunter's bow. One thing I always did before hunting season was to scout the area where I wanted to hunt, and I did this with my hunting partner Joel, whom I attended middle school with, and we were also firm friends. I enjoyed scouting latent areas for hunting opportunities. I was hankering to get a general perspective on the layout of the land and checking for recent deer scat, trails, tracks, as well as water sources like streams, ponds and creeks, where the deer invariably congregate to drink. Bear in mind, Joel and I were particular about our hunting preferences, as we wanted to take down some hefty prize specimen of deer with those impressive racks, but this does require discerning areas not commonplace to other hunters to ensure the best opportunities for success. On our third day, I emphatically believed that we had hit the jackpot, and I discovered a remote spot that was secretly tucked away in the middle of nowhere, and judging by the large quantities of fresh deer scat and the distinctive hoof impressions in the ground, we had found a potential gold mine for our hunting. As we ventured deeper into the heart of the woods, things were looking very promising for us indeed. The wind was blowing against our faces with a cool breeze, and the soft shafts of beautiful sunlight bounced through the forest canopy, lighting up the pretty underlying thicket in soft golden hues, of pretty shades of contrasting greens. We watched the squirrels darting up trees, looking at us curiously, and we saw numerous songbirds that filled the forests with their joyful chorus, and we encountered hefty specimens of deer that scattered past us very quickly, not looking at all thrilled to see us. After a while, I felt like things had changed in the woods, and we definitely sensed an evil malaise. It was as if the cheerful, happy countenance of the woods had shifted and was suddenly overtaken by a dark, ominous presence that was leaving Joel and I feeling exceedingly uncomfortable. It was like we could sense that something wasn't quite right, but we couldn't put our finger on what that actually was. It was quite extraordinary, because the birdsong had all but dissipated, and everything became eerily quiet and incredibly still. You literally could have heard a pin drop. It was that quiet. Suddenly we smelt this really rank, horrible sulphurous smell that smelt like something was rotting. It was causing my eyes to water and my nose to burn profusely. It was a very disconcerting smell. Joel and I started to investigate where this strange odorous smell was coming from, and then we stumbled across this huge 8-foot-tall structure that was overlaid with layers and layers of heavy pieces of timber that had been entwined with vine leaves, making what appeared to be a wooden hut of some kind. We walked in and around the structure, and one area was completely covered with soft grasses and lots of feathery down from birds, and then there were soft mosses that also appeared to be on this sleeping area that had been crushed down by a heavy weight, almost as if something monstrously huge had been lying there. I bent down on my knees to smell the nest and to feel it, and it smelt very punch, and I could tell that it was still warm to the touch, as if something had very recently been lying there. Far too recently for comfort, I have to add. "What the heck is this?" said Joel. I was too stunned to say anything, as I surveyed the whole area very curiously. On one of the corners of the structures were layers upon layers of deer skins, and they hung on top of each other, and then on the walls of the structure were some human clothes. There was a pair of khaki pants, a bright red polo shirt, and a pair of white sneakers on the ground. It gave the distinct impression that a human was living in the structure, because the clothes were in almost perfect, pristine condition, and smelt as if they'd been snatched off the washing line, and the sneakers looked so new and also as if they'd almost been recently washed. It was all decidedly odd. However, I sensed that the clothes were a decoy of some kind, almost there to give you the false impression that this hut-like structure was inhabited by a human being, when in my opinion something non-human was living in here. But what? I could not imagine. "Do you think someone is living out here?" asked Joel, looking at me in concern and regarding the pristine clothes. "I mean, who would live in the middle of the woods like this?" It did seem decidedly odd. "That's what I think we're supposed to think," I said. "It's a deceptive ruse of some kind, by a very intelligent creature." "Done by whom?" asked Joel. "That's what I want to know," I said. We looked around the wooded clearing to see if we could find any more clues for ourselves, and that was when we discovered a massive pile of animal bones, piled on top of each other in a very neat and tidy heap, and I knew that this had to have been done by something extremely intelligent. "Look at this," said Joel in amazement. We came across a pile of impressive antlers and large piles of stones stacked on top of each other, leaving us with more questions than answers. Who or what was living out here, I wondered. The only intelligent creature capable of doing this was a Bigfoot or a Sasquatch, I thought. However, it had never crossed my mind or even momentarily occurred to me that these creatures could actually really be real. I truly believe that all the so-called Bigfoot encounters you hear about were a product of misidentification, and that most erroneous sightings had been that of a bear rather than a Sasquatch. Now I was beginning to wonder whether I could be wrong. Suddenly I really began to feel as if we were being watched. I could feel and sense a pair of predatory eyes on me, and I began to feel very unsettled. I could feel my heart pounding and my pulse racing. Suddenly this terrifying feeling of impending doom engulfed my whole being, that gave me the expeditious desire to evacuate this place as quickly as I possibly could, and never ever come back. I could feel, sense, and taste evil, almost as if I'd been fumbling around the devil's lair, and he was about to come out after me with his pitchfork in tow. "Let's get out of here," I said to Joel. "Now!" Joel did not answer me. He stood still, like a motionless statue, seemingly frozen to the spot, and he was pointing towards some saplings in the thick undergrowth that appeared to be swaying menacingly backwards and forwards and backwards and forwards. And then suddenly, between some of the open spaces in the leaves, I could detect a very large, dark, shadowy form that at first glance looked remarkably like a bear. Suddenly a small sapling was pulled towards one side like a large curtain, and staring at us through the undergrowth was an enormous cone-shaped face that looked remarkably ape-like in appearance, with very deep-set, dark, hostile eyes that were so filled with hateful rage. The creature was straddled on all fours, and then he rose up on 2 feet, towering at an impressive 9 feet. It started pounding its monstrous chest and stamping its enormous muscular legs in an act of incandescent rage. The creature was Herculean in size. He looked like he'd stepped out of a monster movie and taken on physical form. It was without doubt a Bigfoot or a Sasquatch, and it was covered with loose, fleecy, dark hair that looked exactly like dreadlocks, and it was very matted and tangled and smelt incredibly rank. Now I knew where the foul smell emanated from. The creature was wearing the smell, and he began to huff and puff and make these dreadful, deep, guttural, irate grunts that sounded distinctly ape-like. He continued to beat and pound his chest in a very dominant stance, and he began to curl back his mouth to reveal a set of pearly, huge, human-like teeth, and then the creature began to roar like a lion. The only problem is a lion's roar would have been intimidated. This would have been far more intimidating than any lion's roar, let me tell you. He proceeded to reach for some hefty tree branches and splintered them in front of us as if to say, "This is what I'm going to do to you." It was like he was taunting, deriding, heckling and teasing us to engender fear in every fibre of our being, and his tactics were working brilliantly. We were so terrified. We barely knew what to do. Never before had I ever felt so feeble and so pathetic in all my life. The capricious Bigfoot reminded me of those out-of-control erratic elephants you get in Africa when they come into musk because of their high levels of testosterone that seem to drive them to heightened levels of belligerent aggression. He was behaving exactly like this. "Walk slowly," I commanded Joel. "Whatever you do, make sure you do not run. Avoid any eye contact with the creature. Keep looking down and act submissive." Joel and I focused on the ground, avoiding the creature's gaze, and turned around, walking away very, very slowly. The creature continued to roar, and then he started hurling stones at us, provoking us to run, so that he could pursue us and either harm us or kill us. "Keep walking, Joel," I commanded. "Keep walking. Don't run. Don't run. Joel, don't run." It was the most onerous thing that I've ever done, walking away slowly, because believe me, it was so hard. I wanted to run away as fast as I possibly could, almost as much as this creature clearly wanted to tear us apart, limb from limb. But first he wanted to get us to run. I was certain of that. I could feel those cold, dark eyes burning through us, and that hatred was so palpable you could physically feel it. Even as we walked away, we were both physically shaking. "I cannot do this," whispered Joel. "I need to run. I've got to get away from this monster. I can't keep walking like this. I just can't. There's no way. I've got to run." "If you run, you are dead," I said. "He wants you to run because he gets off on it. You will be giving him what he wants. Don't run. Keep walking." We could hear the creature behind us, and he was huffing and puffing and making these terrifying grunts, and his breathing was so heavy you could almost feel it at the back of your neck. Joel just suddenly lost it. He couldn't take it any more. He just had to run from the creature as fast as he could, and I watched him sprinting away, and I groaned. "Oh!" The creature went dashing after Joel at lightning speed on his long, agile, hairy legs, passing me in the pursuit of his friend. Not even realizing that I was there, he was so intent on getting to Joel. Joel was now living on borrowed time. I knew it, and he must have known it. I had to help him, but I did not have a rifle with me, so I acquired a broken tree limb that was big enough for me to use, and then I started running after the Bigfoot that was pursuing Joel. My heart was pounding in my chest violently, and I was living on adrenaline surging that surged through my body so fast that it intensified my steps to lightning speed. I myself could not believe how fast I was actually running. The Bigfoot grabbed my friend with his powerful arms, straddling him by the throat with one of his hefty elbows. I knew that one click of the neck to the left or one click to the right, and it would be lights out for my friend forever and ever. It would be over for him. The Bigfoot was so focused on pursuing Joel and killing him that he did not realize that I was standing literally a foot behind him, and I dropped my tree limb and picked up a large rock I found on the ground, and I threw it upwards, because the Bigfoot was very tall, to the back of his head, with brute force, aiming it at the creature. My aim was spot on and incredulous, even if I say so myself. I had hit him in the back of the head incredibly hard, and the huge wacky blow caused the creature's head to wobble precariously. The Bigfoot turned around to look at me through dazed, fuzzy eyes that had almost lost their focus completely. It would seem that he had become disorientated and dizzy, and his anger was temporarily suppressed because he clearly didn't know where he was. He released his grip on Joel, and his eyes rolled in the back of his head, and he looked more and more confused and he certainly lost his faculties for a moment, and could not remember who or where he was. I think the head bang had definitely concussed him. While the Bigfoot was in a mental stupor, a seemingly whirling maze of blurring stars rocketing in his head like a flurry of colourful fireworks, I took my opportunity to get Joel to move. "Run, Joel! Run now!" I shouted to him and took full advantage of the Bigfoot's unstable mental condition, and Joel and I began to run as fast as we possibly could from the creature, and we managed to make it back to my jeep, and we sped away as fast as we could, not daring to look back. But fortunately, I think the Bigfoot was still seeing stars, and so wasn't going to be running after us any time soon. "You just saved my life," gasped Joel in astonishment. "You really managed to make him lose his mental coordination. What did you do?" "I threw a heavy rock at his head as hard as I could," I said. "I think we can safely say he's concussed for the moment." "That was quite some hit," said Joel in admiration. "That took some serious balls on your account. Maybe none of this would have had to happen if you hadn't run away like you did." Joel did not answer, but he did look sheepish. I was furious with him for running off like he did, and very upset with him for not listening to me. I really believed if we had walked away quietly, we may have been all right. I decided to call the police, and I told them that there was a dangerous creature in those woods that had attacked us, but I didn't say it had been a Bigfoot. My excuse was I couldn't see it, but it was chasing us. I told them about the strange nest I'd also seen, and the pristine human clothes hanging on some branches. They asked me to describe the clothes to them. They told me that a man had been skinny dipping in the creek recently, and had hung his clothes, fitting the exact description of the clothes that we had seen in the Bigfoot hut. While he went for a swim with his wife in the water, it would seem he had mysteriously vanished after he'd climbed out of the water to retrieve his towel. The wife had seen him drying himself with a swimming towel, and then she turned around to continue her swim in the creek for a little while longer, and when she turned around he appeared to be no longer there, and he seemed to have vanished into thin air. She had searched the entire area for him, calling out his name, but was met with a wall of silence. She had described the whole area as very quiet and taking on a menacing atmosphere. All the wife could see was her husband's clothes hanging on the bush and his sneakers lying beside them on the ground, but she could see no sight or sound of her husband anywhere. She forgot about her husband's clothes on the bush when she went around to just call him and to look for him. But after she came back to retrieve the clothes, they had all gone missing. It was all exceedingly odd, although she did say that she had sensed that something very evil was watching her. A single officer came to interview me, along with a man from the army who wanted me to tell them where I'd seen the strange creature, and I saw an army van with men and guns driving to the location. I never heard what happened, but I'm almost certain that the woman's husband was killed by that nasty Bigfoot, and as for why the creature went to get the human clothes after that, I honestly don't know why. I initially thought that those clothes were some kind of a ruse by the animal. I now believe that they might actually be some kind of a trophy that the animal keeps. It was extraordinary that the Bigfoot kept this man's clothes in such pristine, perfect, mint condition in his hut. And that's something hard to understand. When I told my father what had actually happened to us on our scouting trip, he reprimanded me severely for not taking a rifle with me. He also insisted that Joel and I went back to the location, as he was pretty certain that the army would have dealt with that Bigfoot by now, and that even if they hadn't killed him, the creature would be long gone by now. I was certain he was right. My father believed that if you fell off a horse, you simply had to get back on it, regardless how afraid you were. Otherwise, he said, the fear would destroy and incapacitate your life. It took a great deal of persuasion to get Joel to come back with me to the area of our harrowing encounter, but I finally managed to persuade him. He was such an emotional wreck and was suffering from severe post-traumatic stress after our harrowing ordeal, but after a lot of persuasion, he did finally come with me. We saw no sign of the Bigfoot nest or the piles of bones or stones we had discovered. Everything had vanished and appeared to look very normal. I noticed that the pretty birdsong in the valley had returned, and the wood was alive with squirrels and chipmunks who seemed to have moved into the area. So it was with great trepidation that Joel and I went deer hunting there again. And as you can imagine, we managed to take down a couple of prize specimens of deer with the most imposing racks I've ever seen. Joel has now recovered from his ordeal, and so have I. But if we had not gone back to that place of our attack, I doubt we'd ever got over our ordeal. In fact, I doubt that we'd ever have gone bow hunting again. My advice is to always get back on the horse, because you will be glad you did. I just want to say thank you so much for that story, and I totally agree with you. I mean, I remember once having an accident where I fell off a horse, and my riding teacher at the time insisted that I got back on the horse, and it was the best thing I ever did, because I wasn't afraid afterwards. But I think if I had not got back on the horse, it could have really affected me quite badly and discouraged me from riding again in the future. So I definitely think overcoming your fear by doing it again or going back to the spot is a very important thing for a person to do. And you certainly had the most horrifying Bigfoot encounter. And as for the clothes hanging up, I liked your idea of that being a ruse. It could have been a ruse. It could have been a way of somebody going into a hut and thinking, oh, this must be somebody living out here in the middle of nowhere, and literally not realizing that it was a Bigfoot den. On the other hand, it could be a trophy. I think a trophy, the Bigfoot thinks, I've killed this man. Here's a trophy. This is the clothes that he was wearing. Why he went back for those clothes, that can only be for a trophy, I think. But how did he know it was the man's clothes in the first place? That is pretty extraordinary. So I think we've got a very intelligent Bigfoot here. Dear Sarah and all your listeners, my name is Sophie. My Bigfoot encounter happened to me in 1995 when I was only 15 years old at the time. I grew up in the beautiful Charleston area in West Virginia, and all my life I was great with figures and anything to do with math. So I accepted a holiday job with a very wealthy art dealer in the area who just so happened to be my best friend's father. He wanted me to help him with his tax returns and with some general dog's body office jobs that required someone with a head for figures, and so naturally Diana persuaded her dad to hire me over the summer holidays for the job that most people might have found tediously boring and dull, but certainly not me. I went to school with Diana, and physically we were like two peas in a pod because we looked uncannily alike. We both had long, dark, flowing hair, blue eyes, and fair skin. People often believed we were sisters, but although we looked uncannily alike, that was where the differences began and ended. Diana was creative and artistic. She had a natural flair for art, and at 15 years old she was an exemplary, aspiring artist who would be going to art college in the not-too-distant future. Some of her paintings were so phenomenal and unbelievable that she'd already sold some of her pieces of such a young age to art collectors looking to spot an early diamond in the rough. And believe me, Diana was definitely one of those. I, on the other hand, excelled at school in anything that was related to math and figures, and even when I was a toddler of 4, I was always counting things. My mother once told me that when I was a 6-year-old kid, I got terribly upset with the bakery lady who was serving chocolate donuts because she happened to give me a smaller one than the standard size that I usually got. I apologise, said my mother to the bakery assistant, but my little girl says you've given her the smallest donut. You know what kids are like. I assure you, they're all the same size, she said. I'll prove it to you, shall I? And then she weighed my donut, and it was an ounce smaller than the others. So because I had noticed the very serious discrepancy, I was rewarded with 2 big chocolate donuts, much to my delight. For a kid of 6, I had definitely won the jackpot. Another time there was a local fair in the Charleston area, and there was a big prize for the person who could guess how many sweets were in the jar. I won the prize because there were 959 sweets in the jar, And all these years later, I remember how much there were. And I had guessed that the jar contained 960 sweets. People were so blown away that how close I got to getting it 100% right, and couldn't believe I'd actually done it. I still remember the prize I won. It was all 960 sweets in the jar and $200, so I think I did well. So let's get back to the events that would ultimately lead to my Bigfoot encounter. As I said, Diana had persuaded her father to hire me for all those mundane, tedious jobs around the office that require a person with a keen head for figures and certainly administrative skills. So I was thrilled to get my hands on that job, because I came from a middle-class family, but even so, we weren't very well off. My parents both worked in Charleston and rarely struggled to pay my hefty school fees, but my father would have given the shirt off his back to send me to the very best schools of the time, even if it did mean living on baked beans for the rest of our lives. So as you can imagine, they were absolutely delighted about the sub and job I had got with Diana's father during the school holidays. "It'll be so good for you," said my mother. "You will enjoy getting all Mr. Benito's books in order, and he'll be paying you so handsomely. What's there not to like? And besides, you'll be able to have a whole lot of new pocket money to buy anything that you want." So there I was, standing outside the prestigious black wrought iron gate of Diana's father's multi-million-dollar property and pressing the intercom, which was answered by the doorman. "Hello, Bob," I said. "It's Sophie. I'm here to do some tax returns for Mr. Benito." And I found myself being led down the extended driveway that was fringed on either side with tall, majestic oak trees. Finally, I reached the large quintessential Charleston home that belonged to Mr. Benito. I stared in awe at the ample whitewashed home, trying to imagine myself living in the lap of such extreme luxury, where no expense had been spared. The recently renovated historic mansion had been built in 1873 and was a spectacular example of Queen Anne-style architecture, with multiple gable roof lines, double-tiered wrapped-around piazzos with charming spinal work, complemented by large bay windows. The garden was very symmetrically designed, with a restricted white and green colour palette, and hedges pruned to absolute perfection in long square shapes, and everything was offset by a magnificent marble gushing fountain. As I entered the home with its opulent marbled foyer and palatial ostentatious floating staircase, I felt my heart fluttering as I was so intimidated. I proceeded to follow the doorman in the entrance to the grand office that belonged to Mr. Benito. I really felt like a duck out of water amidst all this grand finery. "Mr. Benito is not in today," I was informed. "But if you need anything, ring the bell, and the cook will bring you lunch and refreshment." "Is Diana in today?" I asked. "I'm afraid not. She's out shopping with her mother," I was told. "Of course," I said. "She did tell me. I'd just forgotten." Before long, I was buried amidst piles and piles of paper, and I was in my element, figuring out Mr. Benito's massive tax returns. It was so exciting working with such huge, monstrous figures, because it made the math even more challenging. So as you can imagine, I was in heaven. It was at about 3 p.m, and my mother was due to pick me up in an hour's time from the mansion at about 4, that I decided to take a brief walk around the neighbourhood that would be energising and uplifting, as I had completed everything that I needed to do for the day. "I'm going for a quick walk," I said. "I'll be back in about 25 minutes. It was a very opulent neighbourhood, with the streets lined with majestic tall oaks that towered in the skies like great giants. There were also emerald green meticulously mowed lawns everywhere, and walled terraced gardens, manicured to perfection. It really was great, investigating how the other half lived. As I proceeded to walk down the path, a man in a black imposing car pulled up to me. "Hello," he said. "Could you tell me where Mr. Benito's residence is?" "Oh, that's funny you should ask. I've just come from there," I said, pointing in the direction of Mr. Benito's house. But before I knew what was happening, he had jumped out of his car, cuffed me with his handkerchief all over my mouth, and I was being smothered by a horrible smell, and the next thing I knew, I was so disorientated and confused, and I was being thrown into the back of the boot of a car, struggling to break free and even screaming, but my attempts to overcome these strong arms were futile, to say the least. I was lying there in the back of the boot, hardly daring to believe what had happened, feeling incredibly disorientated and confused. It had all happened so fast, and it seemed so surreal, like something out of a movie and not in real life. I almost had to pinch myself to make sure that this actually was happening to me. I had been abducted, but by who and for what purpose? Nothing made any sense. I started to look around for anything that could help me escape from this dark, claustrophobic, confining prison that was so dusty and smelly it almost made me gag. It was like I could smell wet dog everywhere. I tried to scream and kick, but all my efforts to get attention from passing pedestrians and cars were futile, because the noises of the honking horns, wheels on tarmac, were so deafening I was pretty sure that no one would hear me in those busy streets, and I couldn't open the boot from the inside. That was impossible to do. I could tell that there were two men in the car. I could hear their muffled tones of their voices and very masculine laughter. I still remember that it seemed like a lifetime being stuck in the boot of that horrible confined car, and it was the most terrifying feeling, wondering what was going to happen to me at the end of our journey. So many horrifying scenarios were racing through my head, like being sold into slavery or prostitution, or being raped or even violently murdered. It's amazing how amidst a potentially devastating situation, there was a huge fire burning in my belly that was determined to fight back as hard as I could at any cost. I was thinking of everything I could do to escape the clutches of these horrible men, from biting them to kicking them as hard as I could in the most sensitive areas of their anatomy. Anything to give me a fighting chance to run away, I thought, and to escape their clutches. Finally, the boot was opened, and I was dragged out of the car, kicking and screaming by very, very strong arms. And all that I remember was that suddenly I was injected with something that made me become all woozy and lose consciousness. I woke up feeling incredibly disorientated and also incredibly dizzy. I found myself sitting on a chair with both my hands and arms tied up with bandages, so I was pretty much immobilized. Then I saw him. I will never forget that mean, nasty face as long as I live. He was not old, possibly about 25, but he looked like someone you would expect to see on death row awaiting execution, who was nasty and obnoxious in his appearance. He rather reminded me of a bull terrier because he had those mean, brown, deep-set eyes that were cold and heartless and devoid of any humour and kindness. I remember he did have a very distinctive tattoo on the side of his face of a werewolf. I mean, who tattoos a werewolf on their face? And he had a deep jagged scar on his left cheek that was not attractive at all. "So you must be Diana," he said. "Daddy's very rich, spoilt little brat, I imagine." "I'm not Diana," I protested. "I'm not her." "Ah, very good. That's what they all say," he said. "No, really," I said. "I'm not Diana. I'm not Diana. Look, I'm not her." The man let out a low, guttural laugh. "Very good," he said. "You almost had me believing you there. Quite a little actress we have here." "Now," he said, "down to business. And this is very, very important. And I need you to listen, because if you don't, you're going to be in very serious trouble. And yes, the worst can happen if you don't obey. I need you to speak to your father on the phone and to tell him that you are here with us and that I am demanding $25 million. Do you hear that? $25 million. No less, no more. And that will be for your safe return. In cash, of course." "I told you," I said. "I'm not Diana. I know I look like her, but I promise you I'm not her. Everybody confuses us. Everybody at my school thinks I'm Diana and vice versa, but I am not her. I promise you. If you don't believe me, Phone her father. Phone her now. You'll see that I'm telling you the truth because Diana will be at her house. If you demand a ransom for me, Diana's father will laugh at you because Diana's at the house. I'm not her daughter. Then why were you seen coming out of the Benito residence? If you don't live there, and you look exactly like Diana. I'm working there. I'm doing some admin work for Mr. Benito. I'm helping him with tax returns. That's all. I'm not rich. I don't have any money. Mr. Benito does, but I don't. I just work for him. I watched the man scowl furiously as he opened up a drawer in his desk and brought out a photograph of my best friend Diana. That's her, I said. Look closely at the picture. I admit I do look like her. We are very alike. But look at the nose and look at the cheeks, and they're very different. I've got a very much smaller nose than Diana has. And my cheeks, you can see they're different. The man examined the photograph closely and looked up at me in horror, realizing with a sudden shock that I was right. The buffoon, he shrieked. The stupid, stupid buffoon. I knew I couldn't trust him to get it right. Walter, he shrieked, come here now. I watched the huge beefcake of a man running into the room looking very petrified. I don't actually think I've ever seen someone tremble as much as Walter did in that moment. Look at this photograph, Walter, said the man, growling furiously. You stupid, stupid buffoon. You have got marshmallows for brains and the intelligence of a gnat, he said, thumping the man in the chest with his fist. You got the wrong girl, you idiot. You brought me the maid and not the princess, he sniggered. But she was coming out of the residence. I saw her. Walter, you are an idiot and a nincompoop. Did I not give you a photograph of the girl that I asked you to abduct? You did. Well, did you look at it? Well, she looks a bit like the picture. Did it not occur to you, Walter, to examine the photograph very carefully before you just accosted any girl that you saw walking on the street? Have I really got such a nincompoop for a brother who has not got a brain cell in his little head? Sorry, brother, he stammered. I'm very sorry. Get rid of her now, Walter. And I mean get rid. You know what that means? Or do I need to spell it out to you? Pumpkin brain. No, I got it, brother. I'll do it. You better had. I'll be checking up on you. And then make sure you do go and get the real girl. The real Diana this time. Yes, brother. Good, and do it well. And try and engage your brain if there is one in there at all. I knew immediately that he was telling his brother to kill me. Before I could do anything to protest, the next thing I knew was that my arm was being poked with yet another needle. And after that, I was out like a light. I was totally unconscious because I remember absolutely nothing. The next thing I do remember was that I was lying on the ground in the middle of a woods. I could tell it was a woods. You can always tell a woods. I could hear the sounds of a shovel being dug into the ground, as if someone was digging close to where I was lying. No prizes for guessing what they were digging. I could hardly believe what was happening. I was so drugged that I was barely moving, but I was conscious enough to be aware that it was very dark, and I could smell the sweet, piney smells of the woods. I was trying to fight through the wooziness that I was feeling, but it was so hard because I was heavily drugged. I knew that my life depended on getting through this wooziness, but I kept slipping in and out of consciousness the whole time. I knew enough to realize that Walter was indeed digging a grave for me to dispose of my body, and he was either going to bury me alive, beat me over the head with a trowel, or shoot me first. I truly hoped the latter would be the case, because I did not fancy being buried alive. I'd heard horrifying stories about that. I'd rather be put out of my misery first. but I needed to escape, but my legs and entire body felt like cement pillars. They felt like bricks. I had no strength in my body at all, and I was so woozy and so exhausted and so drugged. That's the only way I can describe how I was feeling. Suddenly I heard a sound of something very hefty coming into the woods. The only way I can describe it is that it sounded like there was a rhino in the thicket thundering towards us. I was too incapacitated by physical weakness to react in any way. I'd just been for way too much. But I could see Walter looking up in angst and dropping his spade in shock. Then standing there, looking at Walter digging the grave, and seeing my bedraggled body lying a few yards away, stood a giant among creatures, the likes of such that I have never seen before in my entire life, and even in my drugged state, I was horrified by what I was actually seeing. It must have been so clear to this intelligent being what was actually going on. As my fogging haze seemed to dissipate, I did get a clearer view of the creature, and I've never seen anything like him. He was majestic, powerful, lofty, gargantuan, and he stood tall among creatures, covered from head to toe with long, shaggy, dark brown hair. The only way I can describe this Herculean creature was he looked like a humanoid ape. As I am good at math, I would say categorically that he was a centimetre under 9 feet tall. He was 5 feet wide precisely, and slightly over 800 pounds, by a very small margin, so he was a hefty fellow. Every part of this creature's body literally rippled with muscle that I could see moving under the hair, and the shoulders on him would make most bodybuilders look pathetically puny by contrast. He possessed the very typical arms you would expect to see in a primate, only his arms were infinitely larger and much more muscular, and he had very humanoid hands and feet. The creature had a distinctive bullet-shaped head, with a long, hairless, dark brown face, deep-set dark eyes, a big flat nose, and a very slender mouth. Suddenly the creature let out the most raucous scream that was so terrifyingly shrill it went right through me, and then he roared, and the vibrational boom was so intense it caused the whole ground to shake like a small volcano. I could hear Walter bawling, "No! No! No!" The next thing I knew was that the creature was beating his chest violently in a show of dominance, and then he lunged towards Walter, and he shrieked loudly, and there was no mistaking his intent. The creature was utterly incandescent with rage and extreme fury. Walter was standing there shaking like a leaf, and was physically crying real salty tears that poured down his cheeks in torrents. I actually almost felt sorry for him in that moment. How could you feel sorry for someone who was actually digging your grave? I don't even understand myself for that. Suddenly Walter was being kicked by the creature with his strong muscular legs, and Walter was howling out in pain, and the creature punched him several times, and then threw Walter into the open grave that he had dug. At that moment, I do not know whether Walter was dead or alive, but he had very definitely been badly beaten, and I was certain of that. The creature reached for some of the loose soil, and making a few angry grunts, he threw a lot of the loose soil over the man. I could feel my heart beating violently in my chest, and I could hear the creature moving towards me. Oh no, I thought, now it's my turn to have my lights punched out by this creature. As he approached me, his movements were very gentle and calm. I saw the creature squatting and looking down on me curiously. I heard him make some strange ape-like grunts. He put his thick finger on my face as if to examine me, and when he saw my eyes blinking, I heard him make an excited "woo, woo," as if to say, "She's alive." He made a few happier grunting sounds as if he was terribly pleased. The next thing I knew was I was being scooped into his powerful arms, and I could tell that to him I was as light as a feather. I felt so tiny and small in his powerful hold. It was so dark in the woods, and I should have been terrified by this apex predator. But the most extraordinary peace came over me, flooding over me with such an incredible warmth. I just knew that he was helping me, and I just felt so relaxed in his huge, big arms. I felt safe, secure, and serene. I had no idea where he was taking me, but I trusted him. I was still so groggy, and so I kept drifting in and out of consciousness. I do not know how long I was in this creature's arm, but I might as well have been in there for an eternity, because he carried me with such smooth grace that I was in a comfortable state. The next thing I knew was that I was being put down outside the door of a farmhouse, and well, you've guessed it, the rest is history. I did report my abduction to the police, and due to the police artist doing a great job on the sketch, the 2 men were identified and arrested. I never told anyone about the hairy humanoid that saved my life for fear of ridicule. I mean, who would have believed me that my life had been saved by a hairy humanoid that I now know to be a Bigfoot? I do believe the Bigfoot knew that Walter was trying to kill me and bury me, and I think it incensed him so much that he went out of his way to help me and took me to the farmhouse where I would get help. You see, the creature was incredibly intelligent. After Mr. Benito discovered that I'd been abducted for ransom instead of his daughter, he and his family moved to Switzerland. I think he was very worried that it could actually happen to Diana again in another situation. I still am in touch with Diana all these years later, who is now a very successful artist. So there you are. That's my story.
Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, I have a fabulous Bigfoot story that my grandfather told me when I was a little 11-year-old girl in 1954, and it was a story he told our family around the campfire on many of our camping trips in the North American wilderness. We would share so many exciting, wonderful stories together, and among them were the usual ghost stories, but my grandfather's stories surpassed them all because they were the most fascinating. And all those years ago, he swore his stories were true. I hung on to every word, and with my incredible photographic memory, I never forgot a single detail of his story. So this is the story he told me all those years ago that I think will be of interest to your listeners and you, of course. I am telling you the story the way it was actually told to me all those years ago, and also the questions I was to ask him. I am in no doubt that my grandfather developed a relationship with a family of Bigfoots. So this is his incredible story that I know you are going to just love. I was only a young boy. I must have been 12 at the time, and I was living with my parents in a lovely little cabin, flanked on every side with woods. I loved to explore the idyllic countryside, and as I did not have any brothers and sisters to play with, my parents told me never to wander off too far because there could potentially be wild animals around. I was told to be ever careful, wary and vigilant at all times. I spent hours around the creek, lifting up all kinds of rocks to see what lay beneath a stone. I would collect tadpoles and watch them develop into little frogs. And I was so intrigued by the progression and marvels of nature. I was fascinated by biology in every form, and I would literally spend ages watching insects and collecting all kinds of unusual bugs. And believe me, I collected some marvellous specimens. I would watch a pair of praying mantises copulating while the female was eating its partner's head during their physical consummation, and she devoured the rest of her partner's body in a ravenous impassion. I remember thinking what a poor deal the male actually had, and how if I was a male praying mantis, I would definitely stay well clear of any famished female. Copulation just simply wasn't worth the energy. One day as I frequented the woods where I loved to play, I was almost certain that something was watching me. I could feel steely eyes on me, and I could sense someone was there. But as I looked around, I saw absolutely nothing. I started to cross-examine myself, wondering why my imagination was in overdrive. Yet try as I might to push away those uneasy, awkward feelings, they kept resurfacing again and again and again. I was being watched. I was certain of it. But by who and by what? I wondered to myself. I retreated quickly from the woods because the feeling was so disconcerting and uncomfortable. And besides, I had to get back because I could hear my mother calling me to accompany her on her daily food shop. As we were in the baker's, ready to buy bread, I decided to try an experiment by staring at people when their backs were turned to me to see if anyone would notice. That way I would know whether the feelings I actually got in the woods were accurate and that something was watching me. I wondered if people could feel and tell if they were being watched. So that's what I did. I saw a young woman entering the shop holding her 5-year-old daughter's hand. I stared at the back of the woman's head, fixing my eyes on her brown bouncy curls. Surely, with my stares on the back of her head, she would not sense them, I thought. As she ordered her bread, she briskly turned around to look directly at me, and she looked decidedly uncomfortable. I knew she had felt my stares because she appeared to be fixing up her hair awkwardly, looking suddenly very self-conscious. Her little girl turned around and stuck her tongue out at me a few times, and I returned the favour by sticking out my tongue and making a few ugly contorted faces at the little girl. She suddenly started to blurt out and to cry and to howl, and her mother shuffled out of the shop with a loaf of bread clutched under one arm and clutching her child protectively with the other. She glared at me as she tottered out of the baker's. I then saw a gentleman standing in another queue, and I stared fixedly at his shoes, and once again I saw him shuffling his feet uncomfortably as he sensed my fixed stares. Suddenly he said, "Son, is there something wrong with my shoes? I notice that you keep staring at them." "No, sir," I replied. "They're just very, very nice, that's all." "You think so?" he said, looking pleased. "I've never ever worn shoes that attracted so much interest before. I am pleased that you like them. I must remember the place I got them for future reference." I was now convinced that my experiment proved that you always know when someone is watching you. So something had definitely been watching me in those woods. But who and what, I wondered excitedly. One day it happened all over again. I was playing in the woods and I sensed something or someone was staring at me. And I knew without a shadow of a doubt that my instincts were 100% correct. After all, my experiment had proved that. I immediately went to look behind every single tree and every available hiding place, but there was nothing there. Then I turned my attention to looking into the trees, and as I looked up into an oak, I suddenly saw a little cute face staring back at me through the branches. But what was this creature, I wondered? I'd never encountered an animal like this before. The animal was about 3 foot tall and covered from head to toe with long auburn hair, only its face was completely hairless. It really rather reminded me a lot of orangutan because it also had those typical long monkey arms, and its humanoid face had a very definite monkey look, especially around the eyes. My heart was fluttering with this excitement as I observed this unique creature that, although exceedingly curious, did appear to be painfully shy. For a while our eyes locked, and I observed that he had the most beautiful yellow-brown rusty eyes that I'd ever seen. I started to climb the oak tree so that I could be in close proximity to the creature, and as I did this it appeared to be laughing at me. I could see amusement in its brown, sparkling eyes. I realised that my clumsy, ungainly climbing had made this little creature laugh, because compared to a monkey's agility, I must have looked like a bungling idiot. Suddenly the little creature became consumed by confidence, seemingly overcoming its natural reticence, and it proceeded to show me how to climb up and down a tree properly, and so I tried to emulate it, but every time I did, the creature appeared to snort with laughter because of my cloddish manoeuvres. I grinned at the creature because I was beginning to realise how gawky and pathetic I looked. It was in that moment our friendship was born, and there was no turning back. It did not seem to matter that we were of 2 different species, although my friend did have extreme human-like qualities, like intelligence, humour, and a huge sense of adventure. We would chase each other around the woods, but every time he swung up on the trees with his long arms and twisted himself up into those branches in all kinds of impressive acrobatic manoeuvres, I knew that I had lost the game, because he was so agile and fast, and I could never compete with such nimbleness. I would visit my friend in the woods all the time, and I do not recall a time in my life when I was happier and more content. Even my mother noticed that I seemed to be so deeply happy with my life, when before she had noticed a rising restlessness in my spirit that had now been curtailed by a positive, happy outlook. I had developed a bond with this incredible creature, but I did not know where he was from or what kind of species he actually was, nor did I know why he was always sitting on the top of the very same oak tree every time I went to visit him. I did wonder who and where his parents were, and why they left him all on his own for such a long period of time. You see, my communication with my friend was never verbal, but with the miming gestures we more or less pretty much understood each other, and I got the very distinct impression his mother looked on the oak tree as a kind of nursery and a place where her youngling could sleep in the trees and remain very safe. I'm pretty certain the creature was actually nocturnal. Well, that's the impression I got. One day as the two of us were climbing a tree in the woods and eating the bananas I'd brought with me, which was something I always did, much to the delight of my friend. Even my mother was commenting on all the bananas and apples that I appeared to be eating in unprecedented copious amounts that seemed to have baffled her, as previously I had been very impartial to fruit of any kind. At this rate, she would say to me, you'll be turning into a fruitarian. I even heard her ask my father whether he thought it was bad that I was eating so much fruit. Did you ever overindulge in bananas when you were young? She asked him. Woman, what are you going on about? Woman, what are you going on about? I'm sure a dozen bananas won't kill him in any way. It's better than sweets. Suddenly I heard a strange shrill whistle. At first I thought it was a call from a bird that I had heard in the woods on many times before. But to my amazement, my hairy friend duplicated exactly the same whistle, as if answering or returning a call. It was then that I heard a thunderous sound, and there she was, larger than life, stepping out of the shadows into the full light of the morning sun, with the shafts of sunlight causing her auburn hair to literally gleam. I knew at once she was the mother of my friend, but she was an extraordinary, remarkable-looking specimen that would have looked impressive, gracing the covers of National Geographic. She was powerful, majestic, lofty, and magnificent. At least I thought she was. Many others might choose to disagree. She towered like a forest giant at about 8 feet tall and was about 4.5 feet wide and 700 pounds. She had the most incredible muscular definition that I could see beneath the scantier hair over her midriff, and it moved when she did. Her Herculean-sized shoulders would make those of an Olympic swimming champion look puny and pathetic by contrast. I noticed that her head was cone-shaped, with what appeared to be an almost human-like pinky-brown hairless face, a prominent brow ridge that was extensively wrinkled, a big pug-like nose, and a very deep-set pair of lively brown eyes that sparkled with merriment. When the creature saw me perching precariously on a branch next to her youngling, I could swear she smiled, as I distinctly saw the corners of her mouth twitch upwards, and her large white human-like teeth remained fixed. I also sensed she was somewhat benumbed to see me in the branches so congenially contented and at ease with her son. My hairy friend climbed down the branches, as did I, and he ran into his mother's arms while she held him, running her monstrous huge hands through his soft hair and tearing apart any tangled strands with her sausage-like fingers. When she did this, she stared at me curiously, almost as if she was studying every detail of a Picasso painting and deciding whether she liked it or not. I'm glad to say by the twinkle in her eyes, I felt almost certain I had won and met with her seal of approval. She started chattering to her youngling in a very strange tongue, all the while scrutinizing me with a keen and curious interest. I could tell by the way my friend was chattering excitedly to her that he was telling her how much he actually liked me, and she reacted with a very pleased demeanour, as if delighted that her sprog had finally found a playmate. She indicated for me to follow her, and all three of us went to the creek together, and while the mother was wading in the water, my hairy friend and I were splashing each other and throwing pebbles. Suddenly I heard this thunderous noise like a herd of rhinos coming towards us. It was such a monstrously heavy sound that you could literally feel the ground vibrate beneath you. Then I heard this incredible roar that was so terrifying I froze to the spot, incapacitated by fear, as the hair on the back of my neck stood up on end. Then I saw him, like the most monstrous, imposing predator, fixated on his kill with a relentless valour. He was wading in the water angrily towards me, with a gargantuan tree-trunk-sized pair of legs and resolute 5 feet strides. Before I knew it, he seized me in his monstrous arms and hurled me into the air like a Catherine wheel, where I went spinning and somersaulting and then plunging into the murky depths of the water. Once again the monstrous giant came clamouring towards me and reaching for my head, almost to asphyxiate me under the water. At least that's what it felt like. The next thing I knew, he released his suffocating hold from me, and I came out of the water like an otter, but desperately gasping for breath. I'm in no doubt that the big male seemed to be trying to kill me, or at least to put me in my place. I could see the female creature screaming at the male and pounding her fists into his chest. He stood there like a statue, frozen in time, receiving the full wrath of her furious physical altercation. I saw her pull his ears that were buried beneath his hair and slapping the sides of his cone-shaped head very fiercely, all the while chattering in a very disapproving, high-pitched voice. Once again I was reminded of that praying mantis, as this female had a powerful hold over the male during their copulation. It would seem that this male humanoid was literally under her spell, willing to do her every bidding, even if it meant being humiliated and chastised in front of me. She let out another scream at him that was so piercing it went right through me like a jackknife. She then pointed towards the bank, and I watched this humiliated 1,000-pound male humanoid paddling away into the water, walking towards the bank. He then sheepishly and obediently squatted down, watching us with puzzled, somewhat exasperated look on his hairless face, as if to say, "Woman, you just can't understand them." I noticed he was watching me curiously, scratching his head in a gesture of thoughtful repose, as if wondering what on earth his little son actually saw in me. I remember feeling in that moment that I truly was safe, and relief washed over me like a foaming wave. But even so, the male was a deadly predator. Of that I was in no doubt, who would kill in a heartbeat if given the opportunity. In the weeks that followed, I would play with my hairy humanoid friend, under the watchful eye of his mother, whom I did see. When I did see the male, he would make a few unfriendly grunts, but he was never very aggressive, and began to accept my relationship with his son. One day when I went to play in the woods, the female humanoid ape and her son howled for a few moments, and that was a bit odd. And then they both gave me something. My friend gave me a collection of pretty birds' feathers, and the female gave an elk skin, and then out of the shadows came the male creature, who presented me with a pair of deer antlers. In that moment I knew they were leaving, probably because they never stayed in one place for very long. They all proceeded to tap me on the shoulders, and then they were gone. Years and years passed by, and then when I got into my early 30s, I saw my friend again. I could hardly believe it, but I recognized him immediately. This time he was a big male. He had become substantial in size, easily at over 1,000 pounds. He looked lofty, majestic, masterful, and beautiful. He was with a female at his side and a little youngling that I imagined was his child. He came out of the shadows to say hello, and it was a joyful reunion. I believe he was passing through and wanted to introduce me to his young family, and I could tell he was ecstatically happy. We spent the whole day at the creek, and it was like we became children all over again and forgot that we were adults and let go of that adult persona. Even the adult female lost her shyness and awkwardness and was overcome by childlike behaviour, and we were all splashing around in the creek together and throwing pebbles. After a while, the creature became exceedingly hungry and started to fish with sharpened pieces of timber, and they were all efficient at catching fish, and even the little Bigfoot made me look like a prize buffoon, because when I tried to use a timber to strike a fish, I missed every time, much to the amusements of the Bigfoots, who were actually laughing at me quite a lot. They started to mimic my lack of coordination in various miming acts, and even I was laughing because it was clearly funny to watch. I was really incredibly clumsy. I took the creatures to my fire pit and proceeded to prepare a fire, and they watched in awe, making all kinds of animated, feverish grunting sounds, and when I finally lit the fire, they all went, "Ooh, ooh." I then proceeded to flavour the fish with seasoning and wrap it carefully in foil, and we cooked it and ate it. I think they loved how buttery the fish tasted, and the way the hot meal melted in their tongue. They ate everything apart, even the heads, only leaving behind the fish bones. I then cooked some beef patties and bacon on the grill, and they got very excited about the bacon and were grunting zealously. They revelled in the salty smoked flavour and the delicious smell, and they smacked their lips in ardent appreciation, and so we all relaxed by the fire, eating and observing the crackling yellow-orange flames, folding, bending and burning the coals and the timber, while we reposefully enjoyed the starry night. I had my guitar handy, and I played the creatures some of my favourite songs, and they were enraptured by my music, and they were swaying their heads backwards and forwards as I sang. They were particularly fond of the B-minus notes, and my friend was tapping a piece of timber on a stone on the edge of the fire pit in time to my guitar. My Bigfoot friend finally got up, tapped me on the shoulders twice, as did the female and the youngling, and I watched them go, with tears flowing down my cheeks, because in my heart I knew I would never ever see them again. I felt that in my heart, that they were moving further afield and weren't coming into my part of the world again. How I sensed this and knew this, I do not know. Near the fire pit I noticed a large set of antlers that my friend had left me as another present, that was to join the one that his father actually gave me. My grandfather pointed to 2 pairs of sizable antlers hanging on the wall, in prime position over the fire pit, and I examined them both with my hands. They were the most sizable, impressive antlers that I have ever seen. "Do you think the creature that killed the deer that possessed these antlers?" I asked my grandfather. "Of course," said my grandfather, sounding very proud. "My friend grew to be a very colossal creature. I imagine he was a remarkable hunter, just like his father was." "Why was the father so aggressive to you when he first saw you?" I asked. "He was probably just being protective towards his youngling, I imagine. They can be very dangerous creatures, especially when provoked, and they are exceedingly territorial." I watched my grandfather's eyes cloud over with tears. "Oh dear," said my grandmother, handing my grandfather a tissue. "Do not get him started on his hairy humanoid friend again, or you'll see the tears. Nothing else gets your grandfather more emotional than those stories from his childhood." So there you are. That was his amazing story. And I realised long after my grandfather's death that the creatures he encountered as a young boy were indeed Bigfoots. I was very lucky to inherit the huge antlers, the 2 pairs of them that now have pride of place on my own living room wall. So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Mason, and I've been a long-haul truck driver for many long years now. So as you can imagine, I've got some incredibly exciting tales to share with you and your listeners that might just make the hair on your head curl, including a very exciting one-on-one encounter that I actually had with the hairy man himself, a way you would never imagine was actually possible. The ironic thing about life is it does have a peculiarly funny way of surprising you and always keeping you on your toes. I say that because growing up in San Francisco in an apartment in Nob Hill, It was really challenging spending many lonely nights without my papa. I remember as young boys my papa would be working for weeks at a time on the open road as a truck driver, delivering freight from San Francisco to Las Vegas. My brother Liam and I witnessed firsthand the stoic isolation and solitariness of my mother's empty, reclusive life that she tried so desperately hard to conceal from us, with no avail. We knew that she really missed our papa. I remember my brother and I made a solemn promise to each other as young boys growing up that one day when we got married ourselves, we would never ever become truck drivers. Never, never, never was the operative word, because we did not want our wives to experience the segregation and loneliness that we had personally witnessed at close hand in my mother's secluded and fractured life. Growing up as kids in the 80s, my brother and I had an incredible, vibrant, spirited and colourful life in San Francisco. At that time, rents were still incredibly low, and I think the cost of our 3-bedroom rental was about $550 a month, which at the time we actually thought was rather expensive. In those days, even artists and musicians could actually afford to live in San Francisco, and they would support their carefree, laid-back bohemian lifestyles in the warehouses of Soma and the Victorians of Mission District. This would not invariably be possible today because San Francisco has become ludicrously expensive these days. I also remember the skyrocketing cases of the whole anomaly of AIDS, which came into focus in the 80s. And also there was the terrible 1989 Loma Prieta earthquake that caused a tragic loss of life in the Bay Area, and my mother lost her younger sister Beryl to the 6.9 quake, which she took years to overcome because her sister was her very best friend. I remember as kids we would race down the San Francisco streets on the back of our bikes and our banana seats. It was in the Reagan era and everyone was wearing sweatshirts with the Esprit logos, and it was much more carefree way of life then, as we didn't have the technology we do today. So we were not physically attached to our cell phones and tablets like they invariably are today. Growing up, my brother and I were transfixed by everything mechanical, as we loved the inner workings of a car. I truly thought we'd end up becoming car mechanics, but it seems I was incredibly wrong. The universe clearly had other ideas in mind for us. When I was about 15 years old, my papa took me on a long-haul truck trip just for the fun of it, and I was totally blown away by my papa's job, and I tried to overcome this rising, bubbling passion and enthusiasm within me, but it could not be suppressed. And when my papa gave me a go at the wheel, well, I was now well and truly hooked and definitely smitten with the idea of becoming a trucker. Worse still, the following week, Liam joined my father on an open road trip on his truck, and he was also completely bedazzled by the truck driving phenomenon, and we were seemingly enticed by its attractive allure, and nothing could stop us. I began to realise truck driving was in my genetic makeup, because I just loved every aspect of driving a truck. My father inevitably did his best to try and discourage us from following in his footsteps, and warned us fervently about the damaging effects being a truck driver could impose on our marriages. But it would seem that my brother and I could not be discouraged. We couldn't be dissuaded or even disheartened by my father's persuasive warnings. Of course, he was absolutely right, because many years later, after Liam and I began trucking, my father's ominous predictions about our marriages sadly came to pass. We can both testify to the ugly demises of 2 of our marriages, as we now have 2 divorces each behind our belts, which is a pretty hectic and heavy price to pay. I also have 2 boys from my second marriage that are both now in their late teens, that are showing a very keen interest in following in my footsteps, and try as I might, I am having huge difficulty in thwarting their eager enthusiasm and intrigue about trucks, much to my ex-wife's absolute infuriation. She keeps telling me to tell them that trucking is absolutely awful and that I hate every aspect of it, but that's going way too far, because I'm not going to lie to my kids. How can I pretend to despise something that I clearly love and adore? That would be blatantly dishonest and deceptive. My attitude is that I cannot stop my kids from following their passions in life, as that would be grossly unfair. A lot of people ask me what it is about trucking that I love so very much,
and I think I enjoy the quality of personal time I have on the open road, and I do spend a great deal of time driving through some of America's most exquisite scenery while listening to my nostalgic, upbeat 80s music that I have never wearied of. The more modern stuff, especially that hideous rap, is something I just do not appreciate and have a very hard time understanding why anybody enjoys that kind of stuff. It invariably can get lonely on the open road, driving over long distances, so if driving a truck is not in your blood, it's unlikely to work for you. I've seen many truck drivers throw in the trowel in defeated despair because they could not hack the long solitary hours of driving on your own. In some cases, people share the drive load with a partner, and that seems to work out better for some who cannot bear the solitude and isolation that truck driving invariably brings. Anyway, on with my stories. On one occasion I was driving my truck in the early evening, and it was literally bucketing down with rain, and it was coming down in cats and dogs, making the road precariously difficult to navigate, and seeing through my windscreen was becoming onerously difficult. I could hear the ominous roll of thunder in the distance, and I knew that this was going to be one heck of a storm. I had a small quota of time to meet my delivery windows in, so I was ultimately going to do my level best to drive through this inauspicious-looking storm, as awful as that was. I knew driving like this was rather reckless, treacherous and dangerous, but quite frankly I didn't have much of a choice. It was getting dim, and I could see the bright yellow, jagged electric light of the lightning piercing through the sky, and the atmospheric electricity on this evening seemed heightened in its intensity. I was driving extra slowly on this occasion through a very built-up small town full of ice cream parlours, boutiques, delis, shops, diners, coffee shops and restaurants. Most of these were closed, obviously, apart from the restaurants, of course. I noticed two people actually huddled under a large oak tree trying to block out the rain and waiting to cross the road as the traffic light was still red. I stopped my truck immediately and signalled for the two people to cross by flashing my lights. I wanted these two poor drenched people to cross the other side of the road, where they would invariably reach shelter under the cover of the shopping arcade. They were completely soaked to the skin, with no raincoat or umbrella between the two of them. In that precise moment, the huge oak tree they were sheltering under was suddenly struck by lightning. The explosive sound was so deafening and way too close for comfort. I have never seen something so alarming and so apocalyptic in all my life before. I observed this lightning literally blow these two people off their feet and thrust them into the air like rag dolls, and it almost looked like they were exploding like fireworks. It was quite frankly horrifying to observe, and I was terrified. I immediately wasted no time in jumping out of my vehicle and dashing precariously towards the two bodies lying on the ground, with their clothes lying in shreds and tatters around them. I was almost certain I was going to observe two deceased bodies. The teenage boy had completely lost his shorts. They had literally been blown off his body in the explosion and were filled with huge holes. It was bucketing down with rain, and the motionless bodies seemed dead, as I would have expected under the circumstances. But I immediately tried CPR, and I started to shake their bedraggled bodies, and after a while they seemed to become revived and come out of their coma. They did not appear to remember anything that had happened to them after they were actually struck by lightning, but through the colossal gaping holes with their jagged burnt edges of their clothes, I could invariably see that they were very badly burnt indeed. I called emergency services at once and helped the man and his teenage son out of the rain by escorting them back to my truck. While we waited for the emergency services to arrive, I remember father and son were so stunned that they literally sat there like zombies, staring out into space for a very long time and not saying a word. I mean, who could blame them? I think their close shave with death had really knocked their socks off, possibly physically, mentally, and very definitely emotionally. I was to examine the burns on their bodies, and I promise you they were third-degree burns with large red rings on their backs that looked like scalding from a boiling kettle. I was surprised that they weren't in pain, but I gather after the shock wore off they did experience a great deal of agonizing discomfort. The emergency services were utterly amazed that they hadn't been killed instantly, given the state of their injuries, but I'm glad to say father and son did both survive these ghastly, grievous injuries and received intensive treatment for their burns, and I gather they made a full and remarkable recovery. Now, being a truck driver, you do invariably get to observe some strange characters on the road, but never more so than on a late winter's evening in Tennessee. I was driving down the road to the scene of a horrifying collision. It appeared to be that one car had smashed quite badly into the back of a small, very cheap-looking utility vehicle, and so I got out of my freight truck to see if I could help at all. There was a young woman looking very shell-shocked because the front of her car had taken a very bad hit, and it would seem was completely smashed in, the engine through the dashboard, so to speak. Frankly, I was amazed that she could have caused so much damage to the front of her car, unless, of course, she'd been speeding, which I suspected was invariably the case. I did detect a somewhat sheepish glazed look on her face, which quite frankly affirmed what I had previously suspected. I could see a man in his 30s who appeared to be climbing to the back of his vehicle via the front seat area, almost as if he was trying to retrieve something from the boot area of his car. His boot was completely mangled and could not be accessed through the back door. The woman was trying to dial emergency services on her phone with her shaking fingers and having very little luck, when quite suddenly the man brought out of his car a long dangling human leg, which he placed on the side of the road, with a very dispassionate look on his face, almost as if he was retrieving an old smelly carpet from the back of his car. I'm afraid the leg came off my mother's body in the accident. Still, it can't be helped. And he said this in such a nonchalant way, as if he was discussing a weather report, and there was nothing wrong about bringing out a dismembered body part out of his vehicle. I was so horrified that I just stared blankly at this man like a mummified corpse, hardly daring to believe what I was actually witnessing. Could this really be happening before my eyes, I wondered, while the woman began to scream, "Oh my God! Oh my God, I've just killed his mother! Oh my God!" She burst into floods of inconsolable tears. The slender hillbilly returned to the vehicle and proceeded to drag out his mother's deceased body with its dangling loose hand and dragged it along the road like it was a sack of potatoes. If things couldn't have got any more bizarre, stranger or peculiar, they invariably did. He then brought out another deceased body and put it beside the body of his mother. It looked like a young female, and she was also deceased. I was so bowled over with amazement that they had actually both died in this accident, and that this hillbilly was acting in such a detached, indifferent manner about their sudden and tragic demise. This time the woman started to scream, "Oh my God! I've killed 2 people!" she said, freaking out. "I'm definitely going down for this. I better call my lawyer." I could see her tapping as fast as she could into her cell phone, and luckily it would seem her fingers were now more composed. "Dad!" she cried. "I've just killed a mother and a daughter." Her phone was on speaker, and I could hear her father say, "You've done what?" And I could hear a woman's voice say, "What has Nicolette done now? Do not tell me she's been speeding again. I warned her about this." "Dad, I've killed 2 people. I need a lawyer, now." "You've got to be kidding," came her father's voice. "What the hell happened?" "I drove into the back of this man's utility vehicle, and I killed 2 women instantly. And her leg is lying separated from her body on the road. Dad, if I'm going to go down for this and spend my life in jail, everyone's going to call me a murderer. All my friends, everybody, they're all going to accuse me of murder." "Now, hush," came the father's voice. "Where are you? I'm coming now, and I'll get a lawyer onto the case now. Do you understand? Nothing to worry about, dear." The 30-year-old yokel looked at the woman and said, "Why are you crying? You've got insurance, right, for the car, right?" "I'm crying because I've just killed 2 women. I can't believe you're acting so indifferent when your mother and your sister, I assume, have both been killed in this tragic accident, and you're acting like nothing has happened." "Well, I didn't care for them much anyway," said the man. "Never did like my mother. She was always such a busybody, poking her nose in everybody's business. And as for my sister, she was a spoilt brat. I'll be damned if I pay any funeral costs for the 2 of them. Do you have any idea how expensive a coffin is these days? Oh, and the cost of a funeral, it's crazy. What did those miserable cows ever do for me? I'll be damned if I fork out a single penny for them.
You know, you really are cruel, said the woman. You don't care that your own mother and sister have just died. All you care about is money. And as for me, I'm going down for murder for this, I'll have you know. And how do you think that makes me feel? The man began to laugh. You think you killed my mum and sister? I found them a couple of hours ago in the house because they both died of carbon monoxide poisoning because of that broken-down old water heater. I kept warning the old lady about the poison gases, but she was too tight to get it fixed. Serves her right, if you ask me. You mean I didn't kill them? Cried the woman, looking agog. You mean they were already dead? You've got to be kidding me. Suddenly I realised that this was all incredibly bizarre. What on earth are you doing with these bodies loose in your car like this anyway? Should you not have called the authorities and got a funeral home involved to remove their corpses from your home in the first place? And what about certifying and formalising their deaths? They might need a post-mortem as well to verify the cause of death. It might not be carbon monoxide poisoning that killed them. That needs to be investigated. It's very illegal, I think, to handle the body yourself like this. I told you, said the man. I want to avoid funeral costs. Why should I inject a penny of my hard-earned money for my sister and mother? Are you kidding me? I'm not going to do that. And I tell you, I can't stand paperwork of any kind. I need to dump them off at the body farm because they accept donations. That's why I came out at night. Do you think you could take me in your truck to dump them off? I don't want anyone to see me. My car's a complete write-off. It'll take me just a second to load them in your truck, and I'll be quick, I promise. They should not be any trouble at all. I mean, they are dead. Most certainly not, I snapped. I want nothing to do with this mess you've got yourself into. You'll have to tell the authorities yourself what you've actually done. This is not my problem, and I refuse to get involved. I haven't done anything wrong, snapped the man. I'm just trying to save a bit of money. What's wrong with that? What's a body farm? Asked the young woman, who'd become more composed and appeared to be somewhat intrigued. I've never heard of such a place. The man pulled out a piece of paper from his pockets. It's at the University of Tennessee Anthropological Research Facility, a few miles from downtown Alco Highway. It's for the study of body decomposition in various settings, and they do accept body donations. You cannot donate your family's body to the body farm, I told the man. I imagine there needs to be a specific clause in their will that stipulates they want their body to be donated to the body farm for research purposes. You can't just dump them off willy-nilly like that. Are you kidding? I thought if I threw them over the fence, that would all be fine, said the man. I'm sure they're grateful for all the donations they can get. And what about anonymous donations? Aren't they an added perk? Even the young woman began to look at the man in absolute horror. Are you for real? She gasped. I can't believe you actually just said that. Do you know nothing about the law in North America? You can't randomly throw dead bodies over fences just because you want to save a bob or two. Suddenly we saw a man and a woman rushing towards the young woman with frantic looks on their faces. Oh, sweetheart, said the father. I've got the lawyer on the phone. He's going to sort this wretched grim business out for you, I promise. Now remember, you were not driving fast, and it was an accident. Can you remember that? You weren't driving fast, and it was an accident. The girl smiled jubilantly at her father and gave him the hugest hug. Dad, I didn't kill them, she said happily. Isn't it amazing I didn't kill them? They were already dead, in the car. He was just going to dump them off and throw them over the fence at the university when I happened to drive in the back of a vehicle. Isn't that fantastic, Dad? The father and mother stared at the man with horrified looks on their faces, as if they were looking into the very eyes of the Grim Reaper, and I could tell by their terrified expressions that they were definitely in flight mode. Before I knew it, they were escorting their daughter back to their cars and running as fast as they possibly could, with a young girl protesting indignantly. But, Mum, I need to wait for the police. What's all the rush? I have to file a report. I realised with all these shenanigans going on that none of us had actually got round to calling emergency services, and so I quickly dialed 911, and within minutes we were surrounded by ambulance sirens and flashing police cars,
and the hillbilly was being bustled away in the back of a police car in handcuffs, protesting his innocence. "I didn't kill them," he kept saying over and over again. "I was just dumping them off at the body farm. What's wrong with saving a bit of money? Doesn't anybody understand that?" I was to find out later that that hillbilly was in fact telling the whole truth, and his mother and sister were actually killed by carbon monoxide poisoning due to a water heater, and he was trying to dispose of the bodies in order to save on funeral costs. It really is a funny old world out there, and some of the stuff is so ludicrous you literally cannot make the stuff up. It's off the charts, totally crazy, which makes the world of fiction almost seem dull by contrast. Another time I was out on the roads. It was late evening during the week, and as I was driving I became desperate to relieve myself, and as it was a rather remote area, I was luckily able to pull my truck to the side of the road and finally park. I know of truck drivers who wear adult nappies because they don't want to take the time to stop, and there are invariably people who will pee in their bottles, but I prefer to do it the most civilised old-fashioned way possible, by going behind a tree. Armed with a headlamp, I climbed over the guardrail, scurried down the grassy embankment, and wasted no time to find a large oak tree to relieve myself behind. And as I began to pee, I realised I was relieving myself on a pile of matted hair and green moss. I wondered to myself what on earth it was. It looked like a piece of discarded old carpet. Just as I was wondering what the strange hair-like thing was, it suddenly began to move. I saw two horrified yellow eyes suddenly opening through this bundle of grey thick carpet. It appeared that I was peeing on top of a living creature. I could hardly believe it. The critter must have been sleeping under the large tree and was awoken to me spraying it with urine, and it was not too pleased by the experience. I'll never forget the expression on the creature's face, because it looked so startled, surprised, bemused, and very shocked. The creature rose from the ground and locked eyes with me for a very long moment. I realised almost at once that she was female because she had furry breasts. I knew at once it was a Bigfoot because I've heard other truckers talk about the critter before, but never in all my born days did I ever think that I would have an encounter like this, and certainly not in these circumstances. I mean, I never imagined that I'd ever go peeing on a Bigfoot. I think the thing that horrified me the most about the encounter was just how colossal and huge this creature was. You hear about it from people who claim to have seen Bigfoot. Oh, he was so huge. But when you actually see him in real life, it's a huge shock. I'd say she was 700 pounds, 8 feet tall and 3 feet wide, with a very distinctive bullet-shaped head, massive shoulders, and arms that were so long that she could have quite literally touched her ankles without bending over. The creature was covered in this long matted shaggy hair that really looked like a huge shaggy carpet, that could have done with a very good brush. I noticed Spanish moss was also growing in her hair, which was exceedingly odd, I thought. The creature had a very gentle-looking angular face and a flat nose and a slender mouth, and very deep-set, kindly golden eyes. I looked at the critter sheepishly because I did feel very embarrassed, especially when I was looking at the wet spot that I'd actually created on a small part of her torso, which she wiped down and actually smelt with her hands. That also was humiliating, because I'm quite sure it didn't smell great. I could tell she wasn't at all impressed, but she was much more upset to have actually been discovered and located by me than the actual act of peeing on her. I think these Bigfoots are very evasive and elusive, and they don't like to be discovered by humans. If they're going to do any encountering, I'm sure it's really on their terms, and not on ours. The creature got up and glided away into the woods with 5-foot strides, swinging her long arms backwards and forwards with such synchronicity. She was so agile, majestic and lofty, and she was beautiful to watch. I don't think I've ever seen anything move so fast and with so much grace. I also never sensed any animosity from her whatsoever, and I should have been terribly afraid, but I guess my shock was literally hijacked my fear. Even so, if you look at how imposing and majestic and powerful and strong she was, I should have been terrified. But I think it was her gentle demeanour that literally calmed me down. On reflection, I'm very glad I didn't pee on a male Bigfoot, because my trucker friend assured me that if I had done that, things might have taken a very different turn, because it would have appeared that I was acting very dominantly, and things could have turned very badly for me in those circumstances. And I have a sneaky feeling that he might be right, because I don't think a male Bigfoot wants to be challenged by a male human. So there you are. That's my story. Did I not tell you that the life of a trucker is a very interesting life indeed? Now you know why I like my job. So that's my story. Well, I just want to say thank you so very much for that story. And I was so intrigued by this story because you can't make this stuff up. It's just so incredible. And I was just looking up about the body farm, and there is a body farm where people can donate their bodies. And the reason it was actually created was because police and forensic science actually like to be able to know how long a body has been deceased in the manner that the body was actually found. So in this body farm, you can actually look it up on YouTube if you want, unless you can't stand looking at gruesome stuff, because I want to tell you it's very gruesome indeed. But they have bodies, under fences, and bodies in the ground, and bodies in all kinds of precarious positions. Obviously, they have to protect them from predators because they want to watch the whole decomposition process so that they can literally determine how long a person was deceased by the kind of insect life that was eating it. They like to see the whole process of decomposition, like when the body bloats and then explodes and all that stuff. So obviously, this guy thought he heard about it. Maybe he was just trying to think of a way that he could dispose of the bodies of his mother and his sister. And I can't believe he thought he could get away with doing that without any legality involved. But he literally wanted to throw those bodies over the fence as a donation to the body farm. And as the guy rightly says, you literally have to have a clause in your will where you literally donate your body to the body farm. So it's a fascinating thing, and it's just so hilarious to think that this guy would literally think he could just dump the bodies like that without a buy or leave. And I just found that really quite unbelievable, how some people don't seem to know the law of the land. But anyway, it was an incredibly fascinating story. And as you say, some things that are actual fact are much more exciting than fiction. So until now, and before I actually end off, I want to say, talk about peeing on a Bigfoot. Can you imagine that? That must be something.
Well, hello there. I hope you enjoyed the omnibus edition. We've got many more coming our way for you to listen to. Sending you love wherever you are in the world, in North America, Canada, Kenya, wherever you may be. I send you lots and lots of love. Thank you for listening to my omnibus, and I really do hope you enjoyed it, because that's the whole idea about it, is to give you some interesting stories to listen to. So until next time, goodbye and good night.